Magandang araw mga kapatid. Binabati ko po kayo ng isang maligayang araw ng Sabbath. Ang pamagat ng mensaheng ito ay Kasiyahan sa araw ng Sabbath. Mga kapatid, alam niyo ba na may mga grupo ng mga Hudyo na nagsasagawa ng isang munting pagdiriwang para salubungin ang araw ng Sabbath? Ito ay tinatawag nilang Oneg Shabbat, na sa wikang Ingles ay Joy of Sabbath. Ito ay isang espesyal na pagdiriwang kung saan ang isang pamilya, magkakaibigan, o ang isang komunidad ay nagkakatipon-tipon sa gabing bahagi ng Sabat upang magsalo-salo, magkakasamang kumakain, nagkukwentuhan, naglalaro, nanonood ng mga palabas at nagkakantahan. At ayon sa kanila, ang tradisyong ito ay nababatay sa Biblia. Buksan po natin ang ating mga Biblia. Basahin natin ang isinulat ni Propetang Isayas sa 58 kabanata at saka sa 13 bersikulo. At babasahin ko po ito sa salin ng Tagalog na ang Biblia. Sa 13 bersikulo, ito po ang mababasa. Kapag iyong iurong ang iyong paa dahil sa Sabat, sa paggawa ng iyong kalayawan sa aking banal na araw, at iyong tatawagin ang Sabat bilang isang kasiyahan, at marangal ang banal na araw ng Panginoon, at ito iyong pararangalan, at hindi ka lalakad sa iyong mga sariling lakad, ni hahanap ng iyong sariling kalayawan, ni magsasalita ng iyong mga salita. Ang salitang kasiyahan na ginamit sa talatang ito ay mula sa wikang Hebreo na oneg, na nangangahulugan na kagalakan at kasiyahan, at ayon rin sa ibang salin ng mga Biblia. Parang maganda yatang tularan ng kanilang tradisyon, hindi po ba? Kaya lang, hindi naangkop ang ganitong klaseng pagdiriwang dito sa atin dahil meron sa atin ang mag-isa lamang na nangingili ng Sabat at ang karamihan naman sa atin ay malayo sa isa't isa. Pero wag po tayong malungkot dahil may mga magandang gawain pa rin naman tayong maaaring gawin upang maipagdiwang ang araw ng Sabat. Sa mga bisita nga pala namin ngayon at sa mga bagong takapakinig, ang Sabat po ay ang ika-4 sa 10 utos ng Diyos. Itinalaga ng Diyos ang Sabat pagkatapos niyang lalangin ang sanlibutan sa loob ng 6 na araw. At sa panahon natin ngayon, ang ika-7 araw ay nagsisimula sa paglubog ng araw ng Biyernes at nagtatapos ito sa paglubog ng araw sa araw ng Sabado. Isang buong araw yan na may 24 na oras. Hindi po kalahating araw o 12 oras lamang na tulad na itinuturo ng ibang mga ngaral. Ang ika-7 araw o araw ng Sabat ay hindi lamang para sa mga Israelita, kundi ito ay para sa lahat ng tao. At yan nga ang nasabi ng ating Panginoong Hesus sa sulat ni Apostol Marcos sa 2 kabanata sa bersikulo 27. Babasahin ko muli ang salin ng ang Biblia para dito. At sinabi ni Jesus sa kanila, ang Sabat ay ginawa para sa tao. Mga kapatid, naririto ang mga magandang mga halimbawa na maaari nating gawin sa tuwing sasapit ang araw ng Sabat, at maituring nga ito bilang araw ng kasiyahan. Ang unang halimbawa na magandang gawin ay pag-aralan at sundin ang salita ng Diyos. Sa pagsisimula ng ika-7 araw, maglaan na tayo ng oras para pag-aralan ang salita ng Diyos at malaman ang mga bagay na nakalulugod sa Kanya. Sa pag-aaral ng Kanyang salita, magkakaroon tayo ngayon ng higit na kaalaman tungkol sa tamang pamumuhay at ganoon din sa mga espiritual na mga bagay. Sa bawat oras na ating gugugulin sa pagsasaliksik ng katotohanan, ay nababaling ang ating atensyon mula sa mga walang kabuluhang mga bagay at inilalayo tayo sa mga masasamang gawain. Kaya sa kalaunan ay nagdudulot ito ng kakaibang saya sa atin dahil napapaigting lalo ng ating paniniwala at pananampalataya sa Diyos. Makikilala natin siya ng lubusan at siya namang ibubunyag sa atin ang mga magagandang mga plano niya na inihanda para sa atin at ganoon din para sa sangkatauhan. At sa pagkakataong ito ay mas nanaisin na natin ngayon ang sumunod sa kanyang mga kautusan. Basahin natin ang nakasulat sa 119 na kabanata ng Aklat ng Maawit mula sa ika-34 hanggang ika-35 versikulo. At babasahin ko ito sa salin ng ang salita ng Diyos sa versikulo 34. Ito po ang nakasulat. Bigyan niyo ako ng pangunawa sa inyong kautusan, at ito'y buong puso kong susundin at iingatan. Pangunahan niyo ako sa aking pagsunod sa inyong mga utos, dahil ito ang aking kasiyahan. Ang susunod na maaaring gawin sa tuwing sasapit ang araw ng Sabat ay tumulong sa kapwa. Mga kapatid, tularan natin ang naiwang mga mabubuting halimbawa ng ating Panginoong Hesus, at isa sa mga ito ay ang pagtulong sa araw ng Sabat. Sa ating Panginoon, ang araw ng Sabat ay napakagandang pagkakataon para makatulong sa mga nangangailangan, dahil dito ay naiibsan ang kanilang mga mabibigat na pasanin sa buhay. Kaya nga pag may dumapit sa atin na nangangailangan ng tulong, ay huwag tayong mag-atubiling tumulong sa kanila. Tulungan natin sila ayon sa ating makakaya at bukal sa kalooban. At kung wala naman tayong maiabot na pera, maaari rin naman tayong tumulong sa ibang paraan. Pwede tayong magbigay ng mga bagay na sa tingin natin ay mas kakailangan nila tulad ng maayos na damit, sapatos, o tsinelas. Maaari rin tayong magbigay ng pagkain, inumin, bitamina, o anumang bagay na makakatulong sa kanilang pangkalusugan. Maaari rin nating kamustahin ang kalagayan nila at ng bawat isa sa pamamagitan ng ating mga telepono, mga cellphone. Pwede rin tayong mag-usap-usap sa pamamagitan ng Zoom, Google Meet, at iba't ibang mga pamamaraan ng pagtawag. Sa ganitong gawain ay hindi natin namamalayan na nagkakaroon na pala tayo ng pagkagalakan at kasiyahan sa ating mga puso. Basahin natin ang unang aklat ni Juan sa 3 kabanata mula sa 16 hanggang sa 18 versikulo. At ito po nakasulat mula sa 16. Sa ganitong paraan ay nakikilala natin ang pag-ibig ng Diyos, sapagkat inialay ni Jesus ang kanyang buhay para sa atin. Kaya dapat din naman na ialay natin ang ating mga buhay para sa mga kapatiran. Kung ang sinuman ay may mga pag-aari sa sanlibutan ito, at nakikita niya ang kanyang kapatid na may pangangailangan at ipagkait sa kanya ang habag, paano mananatili ang pag-ibig ng Diyos sa Kanya? Muntikong mga anak, huwag tayong umibig sa pamamagitan ng salita lamang, ni ng dila lamang, kundi sa pamamagitan ng gawa at sa katotohanan. Kaya mga kapatid, nagiging ganap ang kasiyahan sa araw ng Sabat kung nakikita tayo ng dakilang Diyos na tumutulong sa ating kapwa mula sa ating mga puso. At ang panghuling halimbawa naman na maaaring gawin sa tuwing sasapit ang araw ng Sabat ay magdasal ng taimtim. Hindi lamang sa pag-aaral ng Biblia at sa pagtulong sa kapwa na isa sa katuparan ang tunay na kasiyahan sa araw ng Sabat, dahil mas nagiging lubos pa ito kung tayo ay taimtim na magdarasal sa ating Diyos. Dahil sa tuwing tayo lumuluhod at nagdarasal sa Kanya ay ipinapakita natin sa Kanya ang ating pagpapakumbaba at inilalapit natin ang ating mga sarili sa Kanya. Ipinaabot natin sa Kanya ang ating pasasalamat dahil binibigyan tayo lagi ng pagkakataon na mamuhay upang sundin at gawin ang Kanyang mga kalooban. At sa ating pagdarasal, ipinaabot rin natin sa Kanya ang ating mga kahilingan. Kahilingan na malagpasan ang pandemyang ito, kahilingan na gumaling tayo o ang mga mahal natin sa buhay, kamag-anak, kaibigan, mga katrabaho, sa anumang sakit. Kahilingan na mailayo tayo sa kapahamakan. Kahilingan na tayo mapatawad sa lahat ng ating mga pagkakasala. Kahilingan na maging masaya kahit na napapaligiran tayo ng mga problema. At kahilingan na pag-aanin ang ating mga pasanin sa buhay. At kahit na ano pang unos na dumating sa atin, ay dapat na manaig pa rin sa atin ang pagkakaroon ng madasaling pamumuhay. Nabanggit nga iyan ni Apostol Pablo sa kanyang sulat sa mga tiga-Filipos. Basahin natin ang 4 na kabanata sa sulat ni Apostol Pablo sa Filipos mula sa 4 na bersikulo hanggang 7. Babasahin ko ito sa ang salita ng Diyos. Magalak kayong lagi sa Panginoon at muli kong sasabihin, magalak kayo. Ipakilala ninyo sa lahat ng mga tao ang inyong kahinahunan. malapit na ang Panginoon. Huwag kayong mabalisa patungkol sa anumang bagay. Sa halip, ipaalam ninyo ang inyong mga kahilingan sa Diyos na may pasasalamat sa pamamagitan ng panalangin at ng panalangin may panghiling. At ang kapayapaang mula sa Diyos na higit sa anumang pangunawa ang siyang mag-iingat sa inyong mga puso at pag-iisip sa pamamagitan ni Kristo Jesus. Kaya mga kapatid, ugaliin nating magdasal ng taimtim, lalo na sa tuwing darating at sasapit ang araw ng Sabat, dahil magandang pagkakataon ito na maipakita at maiparamdam natin ang ating pagmamahal sa Kanya. Ganon din sa ating kapwa. Mga kapatid, nalaman natin ang mga bagay na maaaring gawin upang matawag at maituring ang araw ng Sabat bilang isang kasiyahan. May tatlong mga halimbawa na naibahagi sa mensaheng ito na maaari natin gawin. Ito ay ang pag-aralan at sumunod sa kanyang mga salita, tumulong sa kapwa, at magdasal ng taimtim. Sa tuwing sasapit ang Sabat ay ating umpisahan ang araw na ito ng may kasiyahan at kagalakan sa ating mga puso. Ang mga halimbawang nabanggit sa mensaheng ito ay ilan lamang yan sa mga maaaring gawin at gawing tradisyon para maipagdiwang ang araw ng Sabat. Kung may naisip pa po kayo na iba pang mga magandang gawain, ay maaari nyo pong ibahagi rin sa iba nating mga kapatid para makatulong ito para sa kanilang pangingilin ng Sabat. At dahil dito, mapapaigting palalo ang ating paniniwala tungkol sa araw ng Sabat. Wala pong masama sa pagkakaroon ng tradisyon sa araw ng Sabat, basta ang pakay nito ay magbibigay ng karangalan sa ating Diyos at makatulong ito sa kapwa at ganoon din sa ating pananampalataya. Magiging ganap na kasiyahan ang araw ng Sabat kung susundin natin ang makautusan ng ating Diyos na makapangyarihan. Mga kapatid, kung patuloy nating gagawin ang mga ito, ay tiyak na may higit na biyaya na naghihintay sa atin sa kaharian ng Diyos. Basahin natin ang panghuling talata. Babasahin muli natin ang sinulat ni Propetang Isayas sa 58 kabanata mula sa 13 hanggang 14 na bersikulo. At ito po ang nakasulat: kapag iyong iurong ang iyong paa dahil sa Sabat, sa paggawa ng iyong kalayawan sa aking banal na araw, at iyong tatawagin ang Sabat bilang isang kasiyahan, at marangal ang banal na araw ng Panginoon, at iyong pararangalan, at hindi ka lalakad sa iyong mga sariling lakad, ni hahanap ng iyong sariling kalayawan, ni magsasalita ng iyong mga salita. Kung magkagayoy, malulugod ka sa Panginoon, at pasasakayin kita sa mga matataas na dako sa lupa, at pakakainin kita ng mana ni Jacob na iyong ama, sapagkat sinalita ng bibig ng Panginoon. Maligayang araw ng Sabat mga kapatid, at naway mapuno kayo ng kasayahan at kagalakan sa banal na araw na ito.
Good day, everyone. Today, we will continue with the book of Jude. As I mentioned earlier, this book is only 25 verses long. Yet, several topics can sprang out of it. Last time, we discussed the way of Cain. And as promised, we will deal with the last two remaining personalities mentioned by Jude. They are Balaam and Korah. These two remaining personalities have one thing in common. Their conduct influenced many of God's people, which provoked God's anger, so that in most cases, it resulted in the death of many. Let's go to that particular passage in verse 11 of Jude. It says here, "Woe unto them, for they have gone in the way of Cain, and ran greedily after the error of Balaam for reward, and perished in the gainsaying of Korah." We will start with Balaam. There are many things we can learn from the conduct and performance of Balaam. Why? His story is highly intriguing. First, because there is every reason to believe that he was a true prophet of God. God listened to him. God never failed to show up whenever Balaam tried to seek and consult him on matters that dealt with Israel. And in this case, Balak's request for Balaam to curse Israel. According to Jude, Balaam's conduct was primarily characterized by greed or avarice. Yet Balaam was good at trying to conceal his intentions. Too good, in fact, that if one will just scantily read the account, his motives isn't really easily noticeable. Now, part of the verse 11 says, "Run greedily after the error of Balaam for reward." Error here is equivalent or synonymous with deceit, fraud, delude. In other words, in our own language, sa madaling salita, gahaman. What we will do is just to read the story, and I'll probably interject some of my views on the things that transpired during Balaam's encounter with Balak and of course with God himself. But first, as a backgrounder, Israel was known for their conquest against the nations that tried to impede their journey to the promised land. Some of these conquests were God ordained, while some were just Israel's reaction against unprovoked hostilities by nations whom Israel had no intention of fighting. This was the case of the Canaanite king of Arad. It was an unprovoked attack, and Israel had to seek God's intervention to survive the onslaught. We'll find the account in Numbers 21, starting verse 11, or 1 rather. When the Canaanite king of Arad in the southern part of Canaan heard that Israelites were coming by way of Atarim, he attacked them and captured some of them. Then the Israelites made a vow to the Lord. If you will let us conquer these people, we will unconditionally dedicate them and their cities to you and will destroy them. The Lord heard them and helped them conquer the Canaanites. So the Israelites completely destroyed them and their cities and named the place Hormah. Now another case was that of the Amorites. Israel had no intention to invade and occupy their territory. They were just passing through. In fact, they were simply appealing for a safe passage, yet they were denied, and it resulted in the overthrow of this unfriendly nation. Of course, we cannot discount the apprehensions of the Amorites, knowing that how Israel conquered the nations that disliked their presence. Notice how it happened. That one is found in verse 21 of this same chapter, Numbers 21. Then the people of Israel sent messengers to the Amorites or Amorite king Sihon to say, "Let us pass through your land. We and our cattle will not leave the road and go into your fields or vineyards, and we will not drink water from your wells. We will stay on the main road until we are out of your territory." Actually, this was not an intimidating but a polite and a respectful request from a passerby. So continue in verse 23. But Sihon would not permit the people of Israel to pass through his territory. He gathered his army and went out to Jahaz in the wilderness and attacked the Israelites. But the Israelites killed many of the enemy in battle and occupied their land from the Arnon River north to the Jabbok, that is, to the Ammonites, because the Ammonite border was strongly defended. So the people of Israel captured all the Amorite cities, including Heshbon and all the surrounding towns, and settled in them. Actually, there was no reason for these countries to posture as enemies because Israel did not show provocative gestures. They were just on a journey. But then, insecurity and protectionist mindset on the part of the leaders created the atmosphere that led to the downfall of some of them. Of course, we know things wouldn't happen the way it did without God's hands who carved out the destiny of Israel. Now, how did Balaam came into the picture? The news of Israel nearing the border of Moab alarmed Balak, the king of Moab. So in verse 1 of chapter 22, same book, Numbers, the Israelites moved on and set up camp in the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan and opposite Jericho. When the king of Moab, Balak, son of Zippor, heard what the Israelites had done to the Amorites and how many Israelites there were, he and all his people became terrified. The Moabites said to the leaders of the Midianites, "This horde will soon destroy everything around us. like a bull eating the grass in a pasture. Uubusin tayo nito. So King Balak sent messengers to summon Balaam, son of Beor, who was at Petor near the Euphrates River in the land of Ammon. They brought him this message from Balak. It says here, I want you to know that a whole nation has come from Egypt. Its people are spreading out everywhere and threatening to take over our land. Probably considering the state of his army to stand against the battle-scarred warriors of Israel, he needed supernatural backup by hiring the expertise of a well-known prophet in the person of Balaam. He could have opted to be friendly because Israel never initiated the conflicts that resulted in engagement with countries which happen to be along their pathways. So, continue in verse 6. They outnumber us. This is what Balak told Balaam. They outnumber us, so please come and put a curse on them for me. Then perhaps we will be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. I know that when you pronounce a blessing, people are blessed. And when you pronounce a curse, they are placed under a curse. So Balaam was well known to have that kind of power. Otherwise, how could Balak master the confidence that Balaam can do the job? So those who had the means consolidated their resources to put up a handsome reward for Balaam. Continue in verse 7. So the Moabite and Midianite leaders took with them the payment for the curse, went to Balaam, and gave him Balak's message. So Balaam said to them, or Balaam said to the messengers of Balak, spend the night here, and tomorrow I will report to you whatever the Lord tells me. So the Moabite leaders stayed with Balaam. Now, I kind of wonder why Balaam did not immediately dismiss this request. The idea in itself is bad, even if the object of this curse is directed to someone who is not proven as an enemy yet. More than that, you are talking here of God's chosen people. I really have second thoughts if Balaam is unaware of Israel's background and history. Now, in verse 9, God came to Balaam and asked, who are these people that are staying with you? He answered, King Balak of Moab has sent them to tell me that a people who came from Egypt has spread out over the whole land, and he wants me to curse them for him, so that he can fight them and drive them out. So, God said to Balaam, do not go with them, and do not put a curse on the people of Israel, because they have my blessing. So the next morning, Balaam went to Balak's messengers and said, go back home. The Lord has refused to let me go with you. So at this point, the request could have been permanently dismissed by Balaam. But Balak was insistent. So in verse 14, says here, so they, the messengers of Balak, returned to Balak and told him that Balaam had refused to come with them. Then Balak sent a larger number of leaders who were more important than the first. In other words, Balak now sent his high-ranking officials who took the cudgels from the first emissaries who failed in their mission, and, of course, with an increased offer. So in verse 16, they went to Balaam and gave him the message from Balaam. It says, please don't let anything prevent you from coming to me. I will reward you richly and do anything you say. Please come and curse these people for me. Balaam answered, even if Balak gave me all the silver and the gold in his palace, I could not disobey the command of the Lord my God in even the smallest matter. These are reassuring words of loyalty to God coming from Balaam. It cannot be said by someone with questionable adherence to godly principle. So I thought the bribery attempt would have ended at this point. Dapat tapos na. Di ba? Imagine the statement of Balaam. But in verse 19, this is what Balaam said. But please, he was telling the messengers, please spend the night as the others did, so that I may learn whether or not the Lord has something else to tell me. Now tell me, what do you think was Balaam after when God already told him to flatly deny Balak's request? Ano sa palagay mo? Ano sa mind ni Balaam? Why did he allow Balak's men to stay put and wait for a new development? Was he really hoping God will change his mind and allow him to go with Balak's emissaries? And truly, God did change his mind. So in verse 20, that night God came to Balaam and said, if these men have come to ask you to go with them, get ready and go. But do only what I tell you. So the next morning, Balaam saddled his donkey and went with the Moabites. So ang bilis pa sa alas 4 si Balaam. When God approved of this particular journey. So in Numbers 22, verse 22. So God allowed Balaam to go. Yet, in verse 22, it says, God was angry that Balaam was going. And as Balaam was riding along on his donkey, accompanied by his 2 servants, the angel of the Lord stood in the road to bar his way. Medyo nakapagtaka. Eh bakit naman nagalit ang Diyos samantalang siya mismo ang allow kay Balaam na lumakad na? You see, I would rather venture to guess that God's anger was born out of Balaam's inner desire to accommodate Balak's offer. God's approval for him to go was a test to find out where his loyalty lies, to God or to the handsome reward. Because let's face it, what really is it with Balak that will find favor with Balaam? They may be familiar with each other out of previous deals. Maybe they had deals before. But he is a prophet of God who has direct access to the Creator. Now, brethren, there's a lesson here. God will not bar us from making a decision even if it is contrary to His will. Until now, a Christian has the freedom to choose between right and wrong. By keeping Balak's men to spend the night clearly showed his interest on this transaction, and he expected God to finally approve his journey. And God did allow. Pinagbigyan talaga ng Diyos. Now, we will not elaborate on the talking donkey episode because clearly this is sophisticated enough to say that it was a clear sign that God was not pleased with Balaam's adventure. Now, did Balaam change his mind when God clearly disapproved of his actions by letting the donkey speak? Well, in a way, Balaam repented and asked if he has to turn back. Yet the angel let him proceed, but with one condition, and that is he has to speak only what God wanted him to say. Now, it would not be far-fetched to assume that Balaam's mind was already preoccupied with the acceptance fee that Balak promised to shell out on this transaction. When he sounded incorruptible by saying, "If Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I cannot go beyond the word of Jehovah my God to do less or more." Now, could it be that this statement was made to provoke Balak to raise up the reward? Well, I don't know. But considering his reaction, his accommodation, and by keeping constantly in company with Balak and his men, those words sounded like empty platitudes to make it appear that he was on the side of God. Why? He continued to entertain the request of Balak. He kept presenting offerings, maybe to appease God to grant a favorable response to his wishes. Why? The incentive was too large to let go. He was finding a way to do away or compromise with God's decision against Balak's request. Now, you can read the entire story, but we'll cut it short. Did Balaam curse Israel? He did not, but he was creative to find a way to inflict damage on Israel and gain favor from Balak and eventually collect the reward. How? Now here's a little notice passage that will give a hint on what happened. In Numbers 24, in verse 1, "By now Balaam knew that the Lord wanted him to bless the people of Israel." So wala na siya magawa. God has already firmly decided that He has blessed and will bless Israel. So He did not go to look for omens. In other words, He gave up on this particular strategy. As he had done before, he turned toward the desert and saw the people of Israel camp tribe by tribe. Now, the account in these passages did not explicitly mention how Balaam accommodated Balak's wishes to earn his reward and enrich himself. The entire account is silent on the methodology that Balaam used, which resulted in Israel sinning, and that it provoked God's anger against His own people. Balaam's subtlety looks too brilliant to be noticed in this whole episode. Yet Balaam had to abide by God's instruction regardless of his preference, and that is to speak only what God wanted him to say. And Balak was about to give up on Balaam. So, the story seems to end in Numbers 24. In verse 25, it says here, "Then Balaam got ready and went back home, and Balak went on his way." Tapos na. Wala tayong kwento. But did it really end there? Then follows the blissful words of Balaam's prophecy for Israel. You'll find that one. We'll read this one. "The message of Balaam, son of Beor, these words of the man who can see clearly." So that is what he described himself. Who can hear what God is saying? "With staring eyes I see in a trance a vision from Almighty God. The tents of Israel are beautiful, like long rows of palms of garden. beside a river, like aloes planted by the Lord, or cedars beside the water. They will have abundant rainfall and plant their seed in well-watered fields. Their king shall be greater than Agag, and his rule shall be extended far and wide. God brought them out of Egypt. He fights for them like a wild ox. They devour their enemies, crush their bones, smash their arrows. The nation is like a mighty lion. When it is leaping, no one dares wake it. Whoever blesses Israel will be blessed, and whoever curses Israel will be cursed. To this, Balak reacted angrily. Balak clenched his fist in anger and said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, but 3 times now you have blessed them instead. Now get on home. I promised to reward you, but the Lord has kept you from getting the reward. Balaam answered, the same answer that he gave to the emissaries of Balaam or Balak. I told the messengers you sent me that even if you gave me all the silver and gold in your palace, I could not disobey the command of the Lord by doing anything of myself. I will say only what the Lord tells me to say. Actually, this was a repetition of what he proudly told Balak's messengers. It was strongly spoken. We just don't know if it came from the heart. Then, in verse 14, Balaam said to Balak, now I am going back to my own people. That's in chapter 24. But before I go, I am warning you what the people of Israel will do to your people in the future. So after this unfavorable prophecy to Balak, in verse 25, it says, Balaam got ready, and we're back home, and Balaam went his way. Again, end of story. It appears like it did. And it looks like Balaam stood faithful to God, and Balak failed in his bid for bad things to happen to Israel. So where is the greed and error of Balaam for a reward? Can we find it in the whole account? Balaam did not curse Israel as Balak would have wanted. But Balaam found a way on how to inflict evil on Israel so that in so doing, he collected the reward. He was creative to come up with a different strategy to satisfy Balak's intention to put Israel in harm's way. How? Again, here are few passages that at first glance look like meaningless. And I quoted this one earlier in 24th chapter in verse 1. Let's go back there. And when Balaam saw that it pleased the Lord to bless Israel, he went not as other times to seek for enchantments. In other words, he gave up on evil pronouncement. It won't work in his mind. But he set his face towards the wilderness. In verse 2, and Balaam lifted up his eyes, and he saw Israel abiding in his tents according to their tribes. Balaam saw Israel started putting up temporary dwelling places. Remember, these people were still on a journey. Yet they were setting up tents close to the borders or even within the areas of the Moabites. So that in Numbers 25, you will find, or you will notice what actually happened. This is what happened in chapter 25 of the same book, in verse 1. When the Israelites were camped at Acacia Valley, the men began to have sexual intercourse with the Moabite women who were there. these women invited them to sacrificial feast where the god of Moab was worshipped. Then Israelites ate the food and worshipped the god Baal of Peor, so that the Lord was angry with them. How did this happen? Obviously, Balaam fed Balak the idea. The account did not give the details. Maybe Balak sent women to provide pleasures to the men who eventually were influenced by the women in their idolatrous practices. It was not a direct curse that Balaam did, but a stumbling block that provoked God's anger against Israel. So that, and out of the plagues that God brought to punish Israel, 24,000 died. This clearly justified Balak's reward for Balaam. Let's go to chapter 31 for a more clearer happening of the event. Of Numbers, by the way. So, chapter 31, verse 1. And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, avenge the son of Israel from the Midianites. Now, remember, the Midianites and the Moabites banded together against Israel. You'll find that one in Numbers 22 and verse 7. Afterward, you shall be gathered to your people. That is what God told Moses. And Moses spoke to the people, saying, arm some of yourselves to the war, and let them go against the Midianites, and avenge Jehovah on Midian. You shall send to the war 1,000 from every tribe, throughout all the tribes of Israel. So there were delivered out of the thousands of Israel, 1,000 of every tribe, 12,000 armed for war. And Moses sent them to the war, 1,000 of every tribe. He sent them and Phinehas, the son of Eleazar the priest, to the war with the holy instruments and the trumpets to blow in his hand. And they warred against the Midianites, as Jehovah commanded Moses, and they killed all the males. And they killed the kings of Midian, besides the rest of their slain, Evi, and Rechem, and Zor, and Hor, and Reba, 5 kings of Midian. They also killed Balaam, the son of Beor, with the sword. So, that's how Balaam ended. And the sons of Israel took all the women of Midian captive, and their little ones, and the spoil of all their cattle, and all their flocks, and all their goods. And they burned with fire all their cities, their homes, and all their towers. And they took all the spoil, and all the prey of men and animals. And they brought captives, and the prey, and the spoil to Moses, and to Eleazar the priest, and to the congregation of the sons of Israel, to the camp at the plains of Moab, which are beside Jordan at Jericho. And Moses and Eleazar the priest and all the rulers of the congregation went forth to meet them outside the camp. And Moses was angry with the officers of the army, the captains over thousands and captains over hundreds, who came from the battle. And Moses said to them, have you saved all the women alive? Behold, these caused the sons of Israel, through the counsel of Balaam, to commit sin against Jehovah in the matter of Peor. And the plague was on the congregation of Jehovah. So, there you have it. It confirms the technique Balaam used to provoke God's anger, thereby making his deal with Balak a success. Jesus affirmed what Moses said. You'll find that one in Jesus' message to the church in Pergamos. You'll find it in Revelation 2, in verse 14. It says here, "But there are a few things I have against you. There are some among you who follow the teaching of Balaam, who taught Balak how to lead the people of Israel into sin by persuading them to eat food that had been offered to idols and to practice sexual immorality." So there's the answer on how Balaam did it to get paid handsomely. Now there are a few lessons from this Balaam expose. Number one, there are no guarantees that a prophet or a servant of God will not succumb to temptations like Balaam did. Balaam, as earlier said, is a prophet of God. God dealt with him from time to time. In fact, it was God who put words into Balaam's mouth. Thus, the words of God in a preacher's mouth does not guarantee incorruptibility. What lured Balaam to take the job? Again, in Numbers 22, verse 15, it says here, "And Balak sent again more and more honorable men than those whom he sent first. And they came to Balaam and said to him, So says Balak the son of Zippor, Please let nothing hinder you from coming to me, for I will raise you up to very great honor, and I will do whatever you say to me. Please come then and curse the people for me." You see, the offer was wealth and power. Actually, this happened in almost all true churches of God. Greed for money and power, the two dangerous combinations that tend to inflict damage in the church and more often resulted in overthrowing the faith of some. Let's go to Peter. Now, this is a good lesson for us, especially those who are about to assume leadership. In chapter 5 of 1 Peter and verse 1, it says, "The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also of a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God, which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being ensamples to the flock." Then another lesson from this Balaam episode is hypocrisy. Sometimes we need to be sober or be premeditated in our declaration about our religious fervor and doctrinal assurance, that sometimes we sound like we are infallible. Balaam declared twice that even if you gave me all the silver and gold in your palace, I could not disobey the command of the Lord by doing anything of myself. I will say only what the Lord tells me to say. Strong words those, but did it really come from the heart? Because if it did not, it is nothing more than pure lip service. At one point in time, Peter and the disciples bragged on their willingness to die for Jesus. Yet when the time came for Jesus to be arrested, they all disappeared. You'll find that account in Matthew 26 and verse 33 and 35. Jesus quoted Isaiah 23 verse 19 twice. And he said it in Matthew 15 verse 8 and in Mark 7 in verse 6, saying, "This people draws near to me with their mouth and honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. That's why all of us can also succumb to the same mistakes. Hypocrisy is common, and Paul warned in Romans chapter 2 and verse 17. It says here, behold, you are called a Jew. Maybe we should change that to a true Christian, and rest in the law, and boast in God, and know His will, and approve the things, excelling, being instructed out of the law, and persuading yourselves to be a guide of the blind, a light to those in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes who have the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. Therefore, the one teaching another, do you not teach yourself? The one preaching not to steal, do you steal? The one saying not to commit adultery, do you commit adultery? The one detesting idols, do you rob temples? You who boast in the law, do you dishonor God through breaking the law? For the name of God is blasphemed among the nations because of you. That is what Paul wrote. And there are a lot of lessons from this experience of Balaam, but I only put 3. Then the third one is contentment versus covetousness. You can find that one in 1 Timothy chapter 6. These are familiar passages, brethren. It says here, but godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. But they that will be rich will fall into temptation and a snare, and into many foolish and hurtful lusts, which drown men in destruction and perdition. For the love of money is the root of all evil, which while some coveted after they have erred from the faith, and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Love here is translated pelagoria in Greek. It is not agape, it is not philia, or eros. It means greed or avarice, gahaman, o kaya swapang. I believe this is too much if a Christian is greedy or avaricious. I can't imagine it will happen. From time to time, we want to pursue financial goals to improve our lives, to experience the joys of sharing because you have something to give. But to be greedy or avaricious is not normal even among people who are not very serious with their Christianity. But the system, as we know it, especially in politics, is not in a normal state at this point in time. Thus, greed and avarice is pervasive. Brethren, these are just few of the lessons we can learn from Balaam's adventures. The next personality that we will talk about is Korah. So stay tuned for the next topic. So until then, have a fruitful upcoming week and stay alert and be safe. you.